Hey everyone, today we're diving into the fascinating history of the Kikuyu people, also known as the Gikuyu or Ajikuyu. These Bantu-speaking folks have been around since the 17th century, making their home in what is now central Kenya in East Africa. They settled mainly as farmers around the lush areas of Mount Kenya and the highlands, and their agricultural skills allowed them to trade surplus food with their neighbors, like the Maasai people. For a long time, the Kikuyu didn't have a centralized political system. But that changed in the mid-20th century when they became a major force in Kenyan nationalism and the anti-colonial movement, especially during the Mau Mau uprising. Today, the Kikuyu are Kenya's largest ethnic group, making up about 20% of the population. And the ancestors of the Kikuyu, along with other groups in East Africa, were the Thajikyu. This Bantu-speaking group migrated from Central Africa around the late 11th century. They cleared forests around Mount Kenya's southern slopes to make way for farming. As they settled, they spread their skills in iron smelting, pottery making, and agriculture to the indigenous tribes. Archaeological evidence shows iron smelting and new pottery styles in the area from as early as the 11th century. Migrations from the East Coast and Northeast Africa also played a role, creating a blend of cultures and technologies that led to thriving communities capable of producing surplus food. By the 17th century, these diverse groups evolved into two major ethnic groups, the Meru and the Kikuyu, who spoke a Bantu-derived language. The name Kikuyu comes from Swahili, but they call themselves Gikuyu. Slowly, the Kikuyu moved southwards, occupying what is now central Kenya, south of the River Tana, and between the coast and Lake Victoria. This region is sometimes called Kikuyuland. They had the Maasai as southern neighbors and the Somalis to the north. Major trade routes skirted the Kikuyu area, running from Pangani on the coast to Lake Victoria. Kikuyu traditions tell of long-standing trade with the Akamba to the south and the Maasai nearby. The Akamba traded animal skins and uki, a type of beer, while the Maasai offered cattle, milk, skins and leather cloaks in exchange for staple foods and goods. These peaceful trade relations were evident as the Akamba often worked for the Kikuyu during harvest time in exchange for goods. And now, let's talk about their agriculture. The Kikuyu primarily grew millet, but they also cultivated beans, peas, sorghum, yams, and ndulu, a green vegetable they traded a lot with the Akamba. In the 17th century, crops like maize and sweet potatoes were introduced to the region by the Portuguese. They used farming methods like irrigation and terracing, although not all Kikuyu groups adopted these techniques. Their tools included hoes, axes, machetes, and digging sticks. Livestock was important too, providing milk, meat, and leather for clothing. However, unlike the Maasai, the Kikuyu focused more on farming than herding. Owning cattle was a status symbol in their society. While most Kikuyu were farmers, some groups in the south were pastoralists or semi-pastoralists like the Maasai, and the Adi Kikuyu were hunters and gatherers of honey and beeswax. Today, Kikuyu farmers mainly grow coffee, maize, and fruit. Now, let's look at the social structure. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, a typical Kikuyu home was a homestead centered around an extended family, with men having multiple wives. Each wife had her own hut within the homestead, which was protected by a stockade of wood or bush. The buildings were made from mud, stone, and plant materials, and there was a unique tradition that a Kikuyu hut had to be built in one day. This was because they believed that an unfinished house left overnight could attract unwanted spirits. The Kikuyu didn't have tribal chiefs. Instead, their society was divided into several clans and subclans. Today there are 9 major clans. Extended family groups, known as Mbari, were led by senior males ranked by age. Inheritance was passed down through the male line, and in Mbari could include anywhere from 30 to over 300 people. Despite modern changes, the Mbari remains an essential social unit. Family ties were deeply significant, with the belief that ancestor spirits were present to help the living. Age groups were crucial for social status, and rites of passage for adolescents included male and female circumcision. Because the Kikuyu lived in isolated homesteads, often on separate mountain ridges, they didn't have a centralized government or bureaucracy. This isolation fostered strong local traditions and oral histories unique to specific family groups. And now let's dive into their religious practices. Ancestor worship was central to their pre-colonial beliefs. Ancestors were thought to help the living, so the Kikuyu performed rituals and sacrifices, known as Kwaruta Megangona, to honor them. Ancestors were believed to live underground but could appear among the living, often communicating through illness. The Kikuyu also worshipped gods, with Ngai being the supreme deity. Ngai was believed to reside on Mount Kenya, and all rituals were directed towards the mountain. They also believed in harmful spirits who could trouble the living. To appease these supernatural beings and seek their assistance, the Kikuyu held ceremonies involving food and drink offerings, animal sacrifices, usually sheep and goats, dancing, observing temporary taboos, and ritual sexual intercourse. These rituals were not performed by priests but by community elders, often under a sacred tree. And despite long-standing peaceful trade relations, the 19th century brought more violence to East Africa. Arab and coastal traders, along with European forces, began invading the region. The Kikuyu, like other tribes, became more militaristic, especially with the introduction of firearms. Small groups of warriors could now launch significant raids on their neighbors. Trade caravans traveling to and from the coast became prime targets, along with poorly defended villages, which were sources of slaves and valuable resources. These Kikuyu raiding parties were called tabari, derived from the Swahili word safari, meaning journey or caravan. The Kikuyu didn't establish long-term peaceful trade relations with Arab and Swahili coast traders during the 19th century, likely due to their lack of a centralized political system. This absence of unity may have hindered their ability to capitalize on commercial opportunities or better resist the British, who were keen to colonize the region. In 1895, the British established the British East Africa Protectorate, and by 1920, Kenya became an official colony. Moving forward in the Kikuyu narrative brings us to the 20th century and the birth of modern Kenya. In 1924, the Kikuyu Central Association stepped onto the stage, advocating for Kenyan nationalism and challenging colonial injustices, particularly regarding land ownership and missionary activities. Population growth in the Kikuyu highlands exacerbated soil depletion, adding practical problems to their grievances. Led by figures like Jomo Kenyatta, who would later become a pivotal figure in Kenyan politics, the KCA made waves until it was banned during World War II. However, in 1944, the Kenyan African Union emerged as its successor. Kenyatta's influence grew, and by 1947, he was elected president of the Kenyan African Union. Then came the infamous Mau Mau uprising from 1952 to 1960. This was a dark chapter marked by Kikuyu leadership in a militant, anti-colonial guerrilla campaign against white settlers and perceived collaborators. Their aim, to reclaim the White Highlands, fertile lands from which they had been excluded by colonial authorities. Kenyatta was among those tried and imprisoned during this time, though later evidence showed the charges against him were false. The toll of the Mau Mau uprising was heavy, with 32 white civilians and 13,000 Africans losing their lives, and 80,000 Kikuyu detained in camps. Kenyatta's release in 1961 marked a turning point. He was elected as independent Kenya's first prime minister in 1963 and became president in 1964 when the country became a republic. Following the upheaval of the post-war years, Kenya enjoyed a surprising period of peace and economic prosperity. Exports like tea and coffee, along with tourism to its national parks, fueled the nation's growth and success.